The autumn night was still and heavy with the quiet that settles over the Pennsylvania countryside when the last light fades. In the modest brick house on the outskirts of Lancaster, Margaret Whitfield had just turned off the kitchen lights and was heading upstairs. At 57, her evenings were predictable now. A cup of chamomile tea, a few pages of a novel, the hum of the refrigerator her only company. It was a life stripped of surprises, and that was how she preferred it. Surprises, after all, had a way of breaking hearts. But that night, as she reached the top step, the phone rang. It was late, too late. Calls after dark always carried a certain weight, a silent alarm that stirred something uneasy deep inside her. Margaret froze for a second before she turned and walked back down the hallway, each ring echoing louder in the quiet house. "Hello," she answered, her voice cautious. What came next was not what she expected. It wasn't a telemarketer or a wrong number. It was a child, a boy's voice, small but deliberate. "Hello, are you Margaret Whitfield?" Margaret's hand tightened around the receiver. "Yes, I am. Who's speaking?" "I'm Evan," the boy said clearly as if rehearsed. "I'm your grandson. Please come get me from the children's home." For a moment, time stopped. The hallway, the ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, all of it faded beneath the weight of those words. Grandson. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. "I think you must be mistaken," she managed, her voice trembling. I don't have a grandson." "This isn't a mistake," the boy insisted. "I'm not lying. I found out about you, about who you are, and I wanted to call. They don't let us use the phone, but I did it anyway. Please come get me. I don't want to stay here." And then the line went dead. Margaret stood there frozen, the dial tone buzzing faintly in her ear. She didn't even remember hanging up. She just stood still, the words replaying over and over until they blurred into one impossible thought. "Grandson, please come get me." Her husband, Edward, appeared at the end of the hall, startled by the ringing phone and the look on her face. "Who was it?" he asked, his voice still thick from sleep. "Our grandson," Margaret whispered, barely believing the words herself. He said he's our grandson." Edward blinked. "What are you talking about?" "Margaret, we don't have—" "He knew my full name," she interrupted, her voice rising. "He called me by name. And his voice, Edward, his voice sounded like Clara's when she was little." The name hung heavy between them. Clara, their only daughter, their miracle. The girl they hadn't seen since the day she walked out of their house. The girl who, according to airline records and a DNA report, had died in a plane crash 7 years ago. Edward moved closer, trying to steady his wife. "It's probably a cruel joke," he said gently. "There are scams, you know. People prey on grieving families. Maybe someone found your number and thought—" "No," Margaret said firmly, shaking her head. "This wasn't a scam. He didn't ask for money. He didn't even say much at all. He just asked me to come get him." The house felt suddenly different, less like a refuge and more like a place haunted by questions. Margaret sank into the armchair by the phone, staring into the dark. If Clara was gone, she thought, how could there be a child? And yet, somewhere deep inside, something she hadn't felt in years stirred awake. A fragile, dangerous hope. A part of her she thought had died with Clara whispered that maybe, just maybe, not everything they lost was gone. Maybe somewhere out there, a piece of her daughter was still alive, waiting to come home. 7 years earlier, the Whitfield house had been filled with noise, laughter, plans, and dreams stitched together over kitchen table conversations. Their daughter, Clara, had just graduated from high school, the tassel from her cap still hanging from the rear-view mirror of her car. College acceptance letters were pinned proudly to the corkboard in her room, and Margaret and Edward spoke often about the bright future ahead of her. Clara had always been the center of their world. Brilliant, kind, curious, the kind of daughter parents prayed for. But one warm summer evening, everything shifted. Clara called her parents into the living room. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something. I've fallen in love, and I'm getting married." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward blinked, thinking she was joking. "Married? Clara, that's ridiculous. You're 18. You have college ahead of you." "This is real," she said, her chin lifting defiantly. "I love him, and he loves me. We want to be together." Margaret felt her stomach twist. "You're far too young for this. You barely know what you want in life. What about your education? Your plans?" "I don't want to wait," Clara said, her voice breaking slightly. "We've been together for 3 months. He's not from around here. He was just here on business when we met. He's gone home now, but he wants me to come with him." 3 months, Edward repeated, the disbelief turning to anger. "And he hasn't even had the decency to meet us? To ask for our blessing?" "That's not how people do things anymore," Clara shot back, her voice rising. "This isn't the 1950s. We love each other. That's all that matters." "No," Margaret said, the word slicing the air. "It's not all that matters. He's a stranger, and you're not going anywhere." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "You're not even listening to me. You don't understand me at all." "We understand more than you think," Edward said. "And we're saying no. You are not leaving." "I'm not asking for your permission," she cried, before storming down the hallway and slamming her bedroom door. That night, the house felt colder. Margaret and Edward sat in silence, telling themselves that by morning she'd calm down. They'd talk like adults. They'd find a way through this. But when Margaret knocked on Clara's door at dawn, ready to apologize and talk things through, the room was empty. The bed unmade. Clothes scattered across the floor. And Clara was gone. They called every one of her friends, but none of them had seen her. They drove through town, retraced her usual routes, checked the bus station. Nothing. Finally, they filed a missing person report, but the police shrugged. Clara was 18, they said, legally an adult. If she left on her own, there was nothing they could do. Weeks became months. Margaret stopped sleeping, staring at the phone as if willing it to ring. Edward tried to stay strong, but the cracks showed, the bitterness, the helplessness, the quiet dinners with an empty chair. And then, 2 years later, the phone did ring. It was a detective from New Jersey, his tone formal and apologetic. Clara's name had appeared on the manifest of a commercial flight that had gone down in bad weather. There were no survivors. Personal effects had been recovered. A silver cross her godmother had given her, a gold ring Margaret and Edward had gifted her on her 17th birthday. The detective explained that one of the victims was carrying identification and personal belongings registered to Clara Whitfield. Though the remains were badly damaged, preliminary DNA testing from a hairbrush found among the wreckage had shown a partial familial match with samples provided by the Whitfields, enough for the authorities to conclude it was her. What no one knew at the time was that Clara had lost her wallet during a visit to a busy boardwalk 2 weeks earlier. She had never thought much of it. She canceled the few cards inside and moved on, but someone had picked it up. And when that person later boarded the ill-fated flight using Clara's ID, everything changed. The funeral was closed casket. Margaret barely remembered it. The funeral was closed casket. Margaret barely remembered it. She remembered the smell of lilies, the rain on the windshield, the feel of Edward's hand gripping hers so tightly it hurt. She remembered thinking she had failed in the most fundamental way a mother could fail. And from that year on, birthdays were no longer celebrated in the Whitfield home. There were no cakes, no candles, no milestones marked on the calendar. The day Clara was born, once the happiest day of their lives, had become just another day to survive. While her parents searched desperately, putting up missing posters and calling every number they could find, Clara Whitfield was living a different life entirely. The summer she left Lancaster, she boarded a Greyhound bus headed east and never looked back. Days later, she stepped off in a small coastal town in Delaware, where gulls cried over the boardwalk and the salty air carried the scent of fried clams and ocean wind. It was there she reunited with Thomas Reed, the man she had chosen over everything else. Thomas was older by a few years, confident in a way that made Clara feel safe and alive all at once. He spoke about the future with certainty, as if life would unfold just as they dreamed if they only held on to each other. "We don't need anyone else," he would say, brushing her hair from her face as they watched the sun melt into the Atlantic. "It's you and me, Clara. That's all that matters." They rented a tiny one-bedroom apartment above a bait shop with creaking wooden floors and a view of the water if you leaned far enough out the window. It wasn't much, but to Clara it was freedom. They spent their days walking barefoot along the beach, stealing kisses on the pier, and talking late into the night about the family they would build and the adventures they would chase. For the first time, Clara felt she was writing her own story. There were moments when she thought about her parents, about her mother's gentle laugh and her father's quiet pride, but she pushed those thoughts away. That life was behind her now. This was her new beginning. Weeks turned into months. Their love deepened, and their small routines became a rhythm Clara cherished. Cheap takeout dinners on the floor, shared cups of coffee as the sun rose, Thomas's arms around her when the ocean wind turned cold. But one morning, Clara woke with a heaviness she couldn't ignore. The scent of coffee made her stomach churn. The world tilted slightly when she stood too fast. Days passed and the nausea stayed. And then, in the bathroom of their apartment, she stared down at 2 pink lines that changed everything. Pregnant, her hands trembled as she waited for Thomas to come home. When he finally stepped through the door, she blurted it out before fear could stop her. "Thomas, I'm pregnant." For a heartbeat, his face was unreadable. Then he smiled a wide, boyish grin that melted her anxiety. He pulled her into his arms, laughing. "We're having a baby," he said, almost in disbelief. "Clara, this is the best news you could have given me." The days that followed were filled with whispered plans and late-night promises. They talked about baby names, about saving for a bigger place, about the life they would build as a family. Thomas swore he would take care of them. "I'll work harder than I ever have," he told her, pressing his forehead against hers. "You won't have to worry about a thing." But beneath his excitement, Clara sensed an undercurrent of restlessness. He spent more time out late, coming home with vague stories about people he was meeting and opportunities that were too good to pass up. One night, as they sat on the worn couch with the sound of waves crashing beyond their window, Thomas mentioned it. "There's this job," he said casually, as if testing her reaction. "It pays more than I could make in a year, maybe 2. It's a one-time thing, Clara. Just one night, and everything changes for us." She frowned. "What kind of job?" He kissed her hand, avoiding the question. "The kind that sets us up for life. Trust me." Clara wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe that their love and their future would be enough to shield them from whatever risks lay ahead. So she nodded, pushing aside the uneasy feeling curling in her stomach. She couldn't know then that the choice Thomas was about to make, the one-time thing he spoke of so casually, would shatter their fragile dream and pull her life into a darkness she could never have imagined. The night Thomas spoke of that one-time job came and went, and with it the fragile peace that had wrapped around Clara's life by the sea. He left after dinner, kissing her forehead and promising he'd be back before sunrise. She stayed awake long after midnight, unable to shake the unease that had taken root in her chest. Each passing hour without word from him deepened the knot in her stomach. And then, just before dawn, a sharp knock on the door shattered the silence. It wasn't Thomas. It was 2 police officers. "Are you Clara Whitfield?" One of them asked as she stood frozen in the doorway, still in her nightgown. "Yes," she whispered. The older officer shifted uncomfortably. "Thomas Reed was arrested last night during a residential burglary. We need to ask you a few questions." The words barely made sense. Arrested? Burglary? It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. They questioned her briefly. How long she'd known him, where he'd been that night, whether she knew anything about the crime. She had no answers. She barely heard them. When they left, the tiny apartment that had felt like a dream now felt unbearably small and suffocating. Days later, she attended his arraignment, standing quietly in the back of the courtroom while the charges were read: breaking and entering, grand larceny, possession of stolen property. Thomas wouldn't meet her eyes. When the judge set bail far beyond anything she could afford, Clara's knees buckled. It was real, all of it. The man she had trusted with her future, with her child's future, had thrown it all away for a job. At the sentencing hearing weeks later, she sat on a hard wooden bench, heart pounding in her chest, as the judge delivered the words that would change everything. 8 years in state prison. Clara clutched her belly, the small swell that held their unborn child, and felt her world tilt. When she stepped out of the courthouse into the sharp coastal wind, she was no longer the girl who had run away for love. She was alone, pregnant, and with no one to turn to. In the days that followed, Clara barely left the apartment. Bills piled up on the table. The whispers of neighbors who had seen the news seemed to follow her down the street. She imagined their judgment, the pity in their eyes. The foolish girl who ran away for a man and ended up with nothing. Nights were the worst. That was when the voices in her head were loudest, cruelest. With a criminal, Clara? That's who you chose. You threw away your future, your family, and now you want us to help. You made your bed. Lie in it. She could hear her parents' voices, even though they'd never said those words. Maybe they would have welcomed her home. Maybe they would have forgiven everything. But shame built walls higher than any distance, and Clara didn't know how to climb over them. So she stayed silent. The months crawled by. She sold what little she owned and moved into a smaller apartment closer to the docks, where the rent was cheaper and the neighbors didn't ask questions. She kept to herself, working odd jobs when her body allowed, and prepared for the baby's arrival as best she could. She talked to the child growing inside her as if he could understand. "We'll be okay," she whispered into the dark. "I'll make sure of it." But beneath her words, Clara knew she was drifting further from the life she once knew, further from the girl she used to be. The ocean waves still rolled onto the shore outside her window, indifferent and endless, but everything inside her had changed. She was no longer the bright, hopeful daughter of Margaret and Edward Whitfield. She was a woman alone, carrying a secret and a child, waiting for a future she could no longer picture. 9 months after Thomas's sentencing, on a gray and windy March morning, Clara Whitfield gave birth to a baby boy. The nurses placed him in her arms, warm and impossibly small, his tiny fists waving in the air as if reaching for her heartbeat. She named him Evan, a name she had chosen quietly during the long, lonely months of her pregnancy, a name that meant young warrior. The early weeks were hard but sweet. Clara had little money and no family nearby, but Evan's presence filled her small apartment with a light she hadn't felt in years. She whispered stories to him about the ocean they could see from their window, about the life she hoped to give him, a life far brighter than the one she was living now. When Evan was 6 weeks old, Clara received a letter from Thomas. He wanted her to visit him at the state correctional facility 2 towns over. He'd been writing for weeks, he said, but she hadn't answered. He missed her. He missed their son. Please come. The visit meant everything to her. Maybe they could talk about the future, about co-parenting, about how to make this work. But it was also complicated. Infants weren't allowed inside the facility, and she had no family or friends to leave Evan with. That's when she met Mrs. Dorothy Collins, a retired nurse who lived down the hall. Dorothy was kind and soft-spoken, with silver hair and a fondness for baking pies that made the whole building smell like cinnamon. She had seen Clara struggling with a stroller one afternoon and offered to hold the door. Soon, the 2 women were talking over tea. Dorothy told Clara she'd raised 3 children of her own and would be happy to watch little Evan for a few hours whenever she needed a break. The offer felt like a blessing. On the morning of the visit, Clara bundled Evan into a soft blue blanket and kissed his forehead. "I'll be back soon," she whispered. "Be good for Mrs. Collins." The bus ride to the prison was long and silent. Clara rehearsed what she might say to Thomas, how angry she was, how betrayed she felt, and yet how desperately she wanted their son to have a father. The visit itself was a blur. Thomas looked thinner, harder around the edges. He talked about appeals and early release, about dreams of a house and a job waiting for him on the outside. Clara listened, but said little. Something in her had changed. By the time she stepped off the bus that evening and started the walk back to the apartment, the sky had turned violet. But as she rounded the corner onto her street, she saw flashing red and blue lights. 2 police cruisers, an ambulance. A small crowd gathered near the entrance of her building. Clara's heart lurched. She pushed through the onlookers and stumbled inside. A paramedic was rolling a stretcher out of Dorothy's apartment, and on it lay Dorothy herself, pale and still beneath a sheet. "Ma'am, are you Clara Whitfield?" an officer asked gently. "We need to speak with you." The words blurred together. "Heart attack, no signs of foul play, pronounced dead at the scene." But all Clara could think was Evan. "Where's my son?" she cried. "He's safe," the officer assured her. Neighbors heard him crying and called 911. He was alone when first responders arrived. "He's been taken into protective custody until a guardian can be located." But there was no guardian. There were no documents tying Clara to Evan. No birth certificate listing her name, no emergency contacts, no family nearby. By the time she reached the Sussex County Department of Human Services, Evan had already been placed into a county-contracted group home. There, staff gave him a placeholder surname and a case number. And Clara never showed up again. Maybe it was panic. Maybe it was despair. Maybe shame crushed her so completely that she couldn't face what had happened. But from that night on, she vanished from Evan's records and from the town itself, as if she had never existed at all. The phone call from the boy who claimed to be her grandson had haunted Margaret Whitfield every night since it happened. She had replayed the sound of his voice in her mind, the quiet plea, the unmistakable tremor of hope, until it became impossible to ignore. So on a gray October morning, she packed an overnight bag, kissed Edward goodbye, and boarded a bus heading east. 2 hours later, she stepped off in a small coastal town in Sussex County, Delaware, a place she had never been but now felt inexplicably drawn to. The County Children's Services Center was a squat brick building that looked more like an elementary school than a group home. Her heart pounded as she walked through the front doors and approached the reception desk. "Good morning," she began, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "I'm here because I believe my grandson might be here. His name is Evan. Evan Reed." The receptionist gave her a polite but distant smile and asked her to wait. A few minutes later, a woman in a navy suit, the facility director, appeared and led Margaret into a small office. "I understand why you're here, Mrs. Whitfield," the woman said gently. "But without legal documentation, custody papers, guardianship orders, or DNA results, I can't let you see any of the children. It's for their safety." "I understand safety," Margaret replied, her voice breaking. "But please, I'm not here to cause trouble. I think he's my daughter's child. My daughter Clara. She died 7 years ago." The director's expression softened, but her answer did not change. "I'm sorry. That's not enough. We have protocols we must follow. If you can obtain documentation, you're welcome to reapply for a visit. Until then, I'm afraid there's nothing I can do." Margaret left the office with her chest aching. She walked aimlessly through the nearby streets, past weathered row houses and shuttered seafood shops, until she found a bench near the water. For the first time in years, tears slipped down her cheeks. Maybe Edward had been right. Maybe the phone call was a mistake, a cruel joke, a coincidence. Maybe Evan didn't exist at all. She was about to stand and head back toward the bus stop when a voice startled her. "Mrs. Whitfield." She turned. An elderly man in a worn tweed jacket and flat cap stood a few feet away, holding a small envelope. "Forgive me for intruding," he said. "My name is Frederick Hill. I used to manage the children's home. I couldn't help but overhear why you're here." Margaret blinked, unsure whether to hope or to guard herself. "Yes, I came because of a boy, Evan." The man nodded slowly. "I remember a baby who came to us about 6 years ago. Found alone in an apartment after his caretaker passed away. No documents, no family contact. He was given a placeholder name until we could learn more. But no one ever came." He hesitated, then offered her the envelope. "I kept this. I probably shouldn't have, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It was among a stack of abandoned papers left behind by one of the child's caregivers. I think it belonged to your daughter." Margaret's hands shook as she unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was Clara's, looping and familiar, a piece of her long-lost child suddenly alive again on the page. "Mom, Dad, I don't even know how to begin. I'm sorry for everything. I met someone, Thomas, and we're going to have a baby. I know I hurt you when I left, but I never stopped thinking about you. I was too ashamed to call. Thomas made mistakes. He's in prison now, but he's promised to change. I want our son to know his grandparents. I want to come home. I want you to meet him." The letter ended there, the final sentence unfinished. The ink trailed off mid-stroke, as if the pen had slipped from her hand and she had never returned to finish the thought. Frederick's voice was soft. "That's all there was. No one knows what happened after that. She never came back. And the boy, he grew up here." Margaret pressed the letter to her chest, her tears falling freely now. Clara had wanted to come home. She had wanted them to meet their grandson. Somehow, something had stopped her. But one thing was suddenly, painfully clear. Clara's story hadn't ended with that plane crash, and neither had theirs. The letter had changed everything. It had taken Clara's story from rumor to reality, from tragedy to something far more complicated and far more hopeful. Margaret Whitfield didn't know what to do with that hope yet, but she knew she couldn't go home without trying. Before they parted ways that afternoon, Frederick Hill leaned on his cane and spoke quietly. "I shouldn't say this," he admitted, glancing back toward the children's home as if the building itself might overhear him. "But I still have friends on staff. If you come back tomorrow around 4 o'clock, I might be able to arrange something. It wouldn't be official, you understand, just a chance for you to see him." Margaret's breath caught. "You mean meet him?" He nodded. "Not formally. Not inside. But maybe, just maybe, a boy might wander close to the fence by the garden. And maybe his name will be Evan." For the rest of the evening, Margaret barely slept. She read Clara's unfinished letter over and over, tracing her daughter's handwriting with trembling fingers. "I want our son to know his grandparents." The words were a promise Clara never got to fulfill. And now, somehow, they had become Margaret's mission. The next afternoon, Margaret returned early, sitting on a weathered bench near the back garden of the facility. It was a quiet spot, shielded by a row of overgrown shrubs and a wooden fence that had seen better days. She tried to still her racing heart, but every sound, every footstep, every distant laugh made her chest tighten. Then, just as the clock struck 4, she heard it, a soft, hesitant voice, barely more than a whisper. "Grandma, I'm here." Margaret's head snapped up. Standing on the other side of the fence was a boy, no older than 6, with dark curls that fell into his eyes and a shy, uncertain smile. His clothes were simple, his sneakers scuffed, but his gaze was bright and searching. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They simply looked at each other, as if trying to memorize every detail. Then Margaret was on her feet, her vision blurring with tears. "Evan," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Oh, sweetheart, it's you." The boy hesitated only a second before stepping closer to the fence. Margaret knelt down, pressing her hands against the wood as if she could reach through it. "I'm here now," she said, her breath hitching. "I'm so sorry it took me so long." He tilted his head. "Are you really my grandma?" The question broke her. "Yes," she said through tears. "Yes, I am. And I promise you, I'm never going to leave you again." For a while they just talked about simple things, about his favorite games and the stray cat that sometimes wandered into the garden. He told her he liked drawing and that his teacher said he was good at math. Margaret listened to every word like it was a gift, laughing and crying at once. And as she listened, something deep inside her shifted. She didn't need a DNA test. She didn't need legal papers. The bond was already there, invisible, undeniable, and as real as the heartbeat pounding in her chest. This was Clara's child. This was her grandson. When the staff called Evan back inside, he waved to her, reluctant to leave. "Will you come back?" he asked, his voice small. "Every chance I get," Margaret promised. As the boy disappeared into the building, Margaret stayed on the bench, her tears drying in the autumn wind. She felt lighter than she had in years. The emptiness that had lived inside her since the day Clara left wasn't gone. But for the first time, it felt like someone was filling the space. A thread stronger than blood now connected the past to the future, and Margaret knew she would follow it wherever it led. The days after that first meeting passed in a blur. For the first time in years, Margaret Whitfield had something to look forward to. She returned to the group home every week, always at the same time, always to the same bench by the fence. And every time Evan was there, his shy smile growing bolder, his stories more animated. They talked about everything. The books he liked, the stars they could see above the garden, the mother he barely remembered but still dreamed about. Each meeting made the bond between them deeper. It also made Margaret more certain. She couldn't let this be temporary. Evan needed family, not a visitor who came and went, but someone who would fight for him, stand beside him, and love him without condition. And so, after talking it over with Edward, she contacted an attorney and began the formal process to become Evan's legal guardian. The first step was a DNA test, standard procedure in cases like this. It wasn't just about paperwork. It could strengthen their case in court. Margaret agreed without hesitation. Deep down, she already knew what the result would be. Evan was Clara's son. She could see Clara in the shape of his eyes, in the way he tilted his head when he was curious, even in the stubborn streak that surfaced when he disagreed. While the sample was processed, the county granted Margaret supervised visitation rights, allowing her to spend more time with him. Some days they stayed in the garden. Other days, staff allowed them to visit the small playroom where they built Lego towers and read storybooks. Evan started calling her Grandma without hesitation, and each time he said it, Margaret's heart swelled. Weeks passed. The bond grew. And then one crisp afternoon, a plain white envelope arrived in the mail. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, staring at it as if it might explode. Edward poured her tea and set it down gently. "Do you want me to open it?" he asked. "No," she whispered. "I need to do it." Her hands trembled as she tore the seal. One glance at the words inside and the world shifted. No genetic relationship detected. The room fell silent. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Margaret read the sentence again and again, as if repetition might change it. No relationship, no link, no proof that Evan was hers. It felt like the ground had opened beneath her feet. Everything she believed, everything Clara's letter had suggested, suddenly seemed uncertain. Had she been wrong? Was this some cruel mistake? Edward placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "It's just a piece of paper," he said quietly. "It doesn't change who that boy is. It doesn't change what you feel." Tears blurred her vision. But what if it's true? What if he isn't Clara's son? Edward knelt beside her chair. "Then we love him anyway. Margaret, look at me." She did. "That boy needs a family. You're already his grandmother. He already loves you. That's the only thing that matters." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The envelope lay between them like a verdict. But slowly, Margaret felt the weight begin to shift. Edward was right. A test could tell them about chromosomes, but it couldn't measure bedtime stories or whispered promises by a garden fence. It couldn't measure the way Evan's face lit up when he saw her, or how her chest ached with love every time he called her Grandma. Margaret took a deep breath and pushed the paper aside. "You're right," she said softly. "We'll keep going. We'll finish the guardianship process, no matter what." "Good," Edward said with a small smile, "because that boy belongs with us, and nothing written on a piece of paper is going to change that." That night, Margaret slept with Clara's unfinished letter on her nightstand and Evan's laughter echoing in her memory. Family, she realized, wasn't always written in blood. Sometimes it was written in the spaces between heartbreak and hope, in the choices people made to love one another anyway. Winter had just begun to loosen its grip on Pennsylvania when the letter from the court finally arrived. The envelope was thick, official-looking, the kind that carried decisions that changed lives. Margaret held it in her hands for a long time before she dared to open it. When she did, the words blurred through her tears. "Petition for guardianship is hereby granted." It was done. It was official. After months of hearings, home visits, interviews, and endless paperwork, Evan Reed was no longer just a name on a case file. He was part of their family. The day Margaret and Edward brought him home was overcast and cool, the sky heavy with the promise of spring rain. Evan clutched a small backpack, all he owned, and stared wide-eyed at the brick house on the edge of Lancaster. "This is where you live?" he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and disbelief. "This," Margaret said, smiling through tears, "is where we live now." Inside, Edward had gone all out. The smallest bedroom had been transformed into a space just for Evan. Soft blue walls, shelves lined with books and toy cars, a sturdy wooden desk under the window. On the bed was a quilt Margaret had sewn herself, stitched with tiny stars and ships that reminded her of the stories Clara used to love as a girl. Evan ran from corner to corner, touching everything, his excitement bubbling over. "Is all of this mine?" "It's yours," Edward said, his voice thick. "All of it. And the room down the hall? That's where Grandma hides the cookie jar." Evan giggled, the sound so bright and alive that it echoed through the house, filling spaces that had been silent for far too long. Life settled into a new rhythm. Every morning, Margaret walked Evan to the school bus, and every afternoon she waited at the end of the driveway to wave him home. Evenings were spent cooking together, reading stories by the fireplace, or listening as Evan told them about his day, the new friend he'd made, the math problem he'd solved, the soccer goal he'd scored at recess. Edward, who had always been the quiet, practical one, found himself transformed. He taught Evan how to play chess on the old board that had belonged to his father. On weekends, the two of them drove out to the river with fishing poles and peanut butter sandwiches, returning home muddy, sunburned, and grinning. Margaret watched them from the porch, her heart swelling with a happiness she had once thought was gone forever. The house, once heavy with grief, was alive again, filled with laughter and footsteps and the small, ordinary joys that make a family whole. Evan, who had once been just another name in a county file, was now a boy with a room, a home, and two people who loved him fiercely. A month after Evan's move, another envelope arrived, again from the laboratory that had handled the DNA test. Margaret frowned as she slid it open. Inside was a formal letter, printed on institutional letterhead, with a bold red stamp at the top. "Corrected analysis internal audit result." "Dear Mrs. Whitfield," the letter began, "following a routine internal audit, we discovered a chain of custody error affecting several DNA samples processed during the week of your initial submission. Specifically, 2 test tubes, including yours, had been mislabeled during intake, leading to incorrect matching and reporting. We have since reanalyzed your original DNA material using updated procedures and verified identifiers. The corrected result now indicates a 99.2% probability of a biological relationship between yourself and Evan Reed. Margaret's eyes welled with tears. She didn't need the numbers anymore, but still, she whispered, "Clara, he really is yours." For a long time, she just stared at the words. It felt surreal, almost unnecessary. She read them aloud to Edward, who chuckled softly and shook his head. "I told you that paper didn't mean anything," he said. "But if it makes you feel better, I'll frame this one." Margaret laughed through her tears. "It doesn't change anything," she said, "but I'm glad to know Clara really is here in him." That night, after Evan had gone to bed, Margaret lingered at his doorway, watching him sleep. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. His small hand curled around the stuffed rabbit she'd given him on his first night there. And for the first time in 7 long years, the house felt complete. Somewhere beyond the darkness, she felt Clara's presence, not as a ghost, but as a thread woven through the life before her. It was in Evan's heartbeat, his smile, his laughter. The girl they had lost wasn't gone. She had simply come back in another form, carrying her love forward through the boy who now called them Grandma and Grandpa. The lab's corrected report sat on the kitchen table, still crisp from the envelope, but Margaret Whitfield barely looked at it. She'd read the words once, just once, and that was enough. 99.2% probability of biological relationship. It was the confirmation she had once thought she needed, the proof that Evan was, in fact, Clara's son. But now, as she folded the letter and set it aside, she realized something profound. It didn't change a thing. That morning, she found Evan in the living room, sprawled on the rug with a stack of picture books. He looked up when she entered, his face lighting up with that same crooked smile that always reminded her of Clara. "Grandma," he said, holding up a page, "did you know whales sing to each other underwater?" "I didn't," she said, sitting down beside him, "but I do now." She watched him as he read, his lips moving soundlessly over the words, his small hands tracing the illustrations. Her heart ached, not from sadness, but from a fullness she hadn't felt in years. Clara was gone, yes, but here, in the tilt of Evan's smile, in his boundless curiosity and stubborn determination, she was still present, alive in 100 little ways. That afternoon, Edward came home earlier than usual, his work boots still dusty from the construction site. Evan heard the front door open and immediately leapt to his feet, racing down the hall. "Grandpa!" he shouted, throwing his arms around Edward's waist. Edward scooped him up with a laugh that filled the house. "How was school today?" he asked. "I got a gold star in math," Evan said proudly, "and I drew a whale singing." "Well," Edward grinned, "I think that calls for a celebration. What do you say we build a blanket fort after dinner?" Evan gasped, eyes wide. "With the flashlight and everything?" "With the flashlight and everything." Margaret watched them from the doorway, a smile tugging at her lips. The sound of their laughter echoed through the halls, warm, effortless, alive. Once, this house had been suffocatingly quiet. The silence of grief had clung to every corner, turning birthdays into just dates on a calendar and holidays into days to endure. But now there was noise again, joy again, life again. Later that evening, after Evan had fallen asleep inside the fort they built together, Margaret and Edward stood in the doorway, just watching him. The soft glow of the flashlight cast shadows on the walls, and Evan's steady breathing filled the room. Edward slipped his hand into hers. "You know," he said, nodding toward the folded lab results on the table, "that paper doesn't make him our grandson. He was ours long before we ever saw those numbers." "I know," Margaret whispered. "It just proves what my heart already knew." For a long time they stood there in silence, content just to be. Outside, the spring rain pattered softly against the windows. Inside, the house felt warm and full, not because of the furniture or the walls, but because of the people who now called it home. Clara would never walk through that front door again, but she wasn't gone. She lived in the boy asleep under a blanket fort. She lived in the laughter that now filled the kitchen, the drawings that cluttered the refrigerator, the bedtime stories whispered in the dark. Family, Margaret thought, isn't just the people we're born to. It's the people we choose to love, the ones we fight for, the ones we refuse to give up on. And as she turned off the light and closed Evan's door, she knew that no matter what had happened in the past, their story wasn't one of loss anymore. It was a story of love, the kind that doesn't end but simply changes shape